As we said a couple videos ago, we're going to be testing our contract by using the Mocha testing framework. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview or refresher of Mocha and how it works. If you are already familiar with Mocha and you've already used it in the past, then feel free to pause this video right now and continue on to the next video. Because again, this is going to be mostly review if you've already used Mocha before. Okay, so if you're still here now, I'm going to assume that you want to go ahead and get a quick refresher or overview of Mocha. Mocha is a test running framework. We can use Mocha to test any type of JavaScript code that we want. So we can use it to test a front-end application, a back-end application, or even Ethereum code, which is what we are about to do right now. So it's a very general purpose testing framework. Being so general purpose, it has a very small set of functions that we need to understand. So it's pretty straightforward and easy to get started with. Let's take a look at the 3 functions that we need to understand to really make sure that we can work with Mocha. So we're going to take a look at a diagram here really quickly. All right, these are the 3 main functions that we need to be aware of: it, describe, and before each. We're going to talk about each of these functions, and then we're going to walk through a very small testing example to get a sense of how they all work. The first function that we need to be aware of is the it function, and it literally is called just it. The purpose of it is to run one individual assertion on something that we're trying to test. So this is really the unit of measurement for testing. It's the absolute core of testing something. I've been using the word assertion a little bit, by the way, and just to make sure it's clear, whenever I say assertion, I mean to say that we're going to take 2 values, one value that our code has produced, and then another value that we think should be equal to that variable. We'll then compare the 2 together and make sure that the value that our code produced is what we were expecting it to be. So we refer to that as an assertion. If the it statement is the core of any test, then describe is what we use to group certain functions together. We use describe to group together a collection of it functions. Describe is really just organizational in nature. Describe just helps us group together certain functions that are testing the same thing, so that when we go and look at those tests in the future, or when we look at the output of our testing report, we can understand that certain groups of our test are related. And we'll see an example of that very shortly when we actually make use of describe. Now the last built-in function that we need to be aware of is the before each function. Before each is really a utility function that is used to extract some amount of logic that is common to a lot of our tests. So for example, if we have multiple it function calls where we run a test that are all doing some very similar setup logic, then we could use a before each function to extract that logic and only write that code out one time. Now, at this point, I've given you just a very high-level overview of these functions. And if you've never heard of them before, you're probably still thinking, wait, what's going on here? Well, to be honest, writing tests is one of those things where you just have to get your hands dirty. So I really just wanted to give you this high-level overview so that you would have some expectation of what would happen when we start writing our own test. So with that in mind, let's flip over to our code editor right now and start writing out our own tests. We're going to write these tests inside of our inbox.test.js file. At the end of this video, we'll end up deleting these tests, but of course, if you want to, you could always comment them out rather than deleting them. At the top of the file, we're going to write a little class that we're going to attempt to then test. And it's going to be a very straightforward little class. So we're going to make a class called car. Car is going to have 2 methods assigned to it. We'll have one method called park. Whenever someone calls park, we will return the string stopped. And then it will have a second method called drive. And whenever we call this, we'll return the string vroom. Now I think you can agree with me, this is a pretty straightforward test right here, or excuse me, pretty straightforward class. So let's now try writing out a little bit of code with Mocha to run some tests over this class right here and assert that calling park and drive both return stopped and vroom respectively. So underneath class car, we're going to first make a call with the describe function. Remember, describe is used to group together certain tests that are all testing the same subject or the same thing. So we'll call describe, And then the first argument that we pass in is going to be a string. In this case, I'm going to pass in a string of car. Now this string doesn't have to be anything special. I'm not passing in the string of car right here because we're testing a class car. Like there's no intrinsic link between this string and the class's name. The string that we pass in to describe right here is solely for you and me. It's just so that we can have something to look at on our testing output report so we understand what set of tests we're about to run. So this can be car, or this could be car class, or it could be car class blah blah blah. It could be anything we want. It just is only used for organization purposes. The second argument to the describe function is going to be another function. So we're going to pass in an arrow function like so. This arrow function right here is going to contain all the different it test statements that we write that are supposed to be testing class car. So inside of here, we're going to ultimately have one or more it statements. Let's try writing one out right now. So I'll say it, and then just like with the describe function, the first argument is going to be a string that describes the purpose of the test that we're about to write. So maybe in this first it statement right here, we're going to test the park function of the car. So maybe I would provide a string that clearly indicates that we are attempting to test the park function. So maybe we could say something like it can park. This could just as easily have been something like it has a park function, or it park should return a string. Again, it can be whatever we want. Usually we just use it to have something easy to look at on a test output report and say, oh, okay, we understand what test is either passing or failing. So for right now, we'll just stick with it can drive. Or excuse me, it can park, my mistake. Now just like describe, the second argument is going to be an arrow function. And inside of this arrow function is where we are going to write our actual test setup and assertion logic. So again, our goal right now is to make sure that if we call park, we make sure that the string stopped is returned. So the first thing we're going to have to do is create an instance of class park. So inside the it block, we'll say const car is new car, like so. Then we can call park and somehow write an assertion that makes sure that we are returning the string stopped. To make this actual assertion, we're going to use that assert library that we had required in earlier. The assert library, you will recall, is a part of the Node standard library and has a variety of functions tied to it that allow us to make sure that one value is equal to another. Assert has many other functions that allow us to write effective tests as well, and we'll take a look at some of those as soon as we start writing actual code around our Ethereum contracts. So inside of the it block, we can write out assert.equal. Then we write out the value that is produced by our code. So in this case, it would be car.park. And then we pass in the value that we think it should be. So we think that it should be stopped, like so. So we're always going to do the value that is produced by our code and then the value that we think it should be. Assert.equal is then going to make sure that these two values right here are completely equal. If they are, then the test will pass, but if they're not, then the test is going to fail. Now that we have one test put together, let's save this file and figure out how to actually run Mocha inside of our project. So I'm going to save the file, and then to actually run Mocha inside of here, we're going to add a script to our package.json file, which you will recall is inside of our root project directory. Inside of package.json, I'm going to find the scripts section. You'll notice that there is already a test command here, but right now it says, hey, there's no test set up. So we now have a test set up, which means we can delete the text in there and then replace it just with the word Mocha, like so. Now at the command line, we can execute the command npm run test. That will automatically run this script, which internally is going to run the command Mocha. So we'll flip on over to our terminal. I'm going to make sure I'm inside of my project directory, and then I'll run npm run test. When I execute that command, you'll see the text right here, Mocha, appear on the screen, which means Mocha is running, and it takes just a second for it to pop up. Here is the describe statement right here. So we are describing the set of tests about our car class. And then underneath it, you'll see that our it statement of can drive gets printed out and it appears to be passing. So that's great. We've got one test passing. And we could just as easily go back to our test. Here it is right here. And if we change the value that we expect car.park to be to something like stopped, save the file, and then rerun npm run test back here, you'll notice that the test is now failing. And so honestly, this is an error message that you'll see way more frequently than the message saying that all of your tests passed. So very frequently, we will come over to our terminal, we'll run our tests, we'll notice that something went wrong, and we'll have to then do a little bit of debugging to figure out what happened. Now let's go back over to our test file, and we're going to fix this back up so the test is passing again. Cool, that looks good. Let's now create a second it statement. And in this one, we're going to test the functionality of our drive function. So in a second it block, we'll say something like it can drive. I'll place a second function. Inside of here, we'll make another car. And then we will assert that calling car.drive is equal to the string vroom right here. Cool. So we now have two tests nested in one describe block. Again, remember, describe is all about simply grouping together these sets of it statements. So let's now try running this test suite. I'll go back over to my terminal and we'll run npm run test again. Mocha takes just a second to warm up, and then we should see two tests passing. Cool. Now with that last addition of the second it statement right here, you'll notice that there's one thing that doesn't seem that great about our current test setup. Notice how both of our it statements right here and right here both have an identical first line of setup. So both of our tests need an instance of car before they can run. At present, we have duplicated that startup logic or that initialization logic inside of each it block. And one line of code duplicated might not seem like the worst thing in the world, but I'm sure you could easily imagine if we had many lines of setup that were necessary for each of these tests. If we had many lines, then we probably would not want to duplicate them between each it statement. So to handle that case, we can make use of that last helper that we mentioned, the before each statement. Before each is used to execute some general code setup that is common to many tests inside of our test file. So right above the describe statement, we can add in a before each call. We'll say before each, and then pass in another arrow function. Now, any logic that we place inside this function right here will be executed before each it statement inside of our code. So if we now put in something like console.log a, like so, and then ran our tests, we would expect to see this function run, then the it block run, then this function would run again, and then this it block would run again. Again, before each is all about doing some common initialization code for multiple tests. So let's now take this car declaration or this initialization and move it up to the before each. So inside the before each, we'll say const car is new car. And now we don't need it inside the it block here or the it block here. Now looking at this code, you might very quickly realize that something is a little bit off. Notice how we have defined a variable called car inside of this before each function. When we define a variable inside of a function, remember how scope works with JavaScript. The variable car is only available inside of this function or any other function nested inside of this thing. So maybe if we did something like const print car, then we could do console.log car. However, the car variable is not available inside of either of these it statements. If we ran our code right now, we would see an error message that says something like unknown variable or undefined variable car. So how do we deal with this? How do we somehow do initialization in a before each, but still get access to that variable inside of our it blocks? Well, it's a very straightforward thing that we're going to do here. We're going to take our variable declaration and move it outside and above the before each declaration. So rather than saying const car right here, I'm going to delete the const, and then above the before each, I'll say let car. So now, inside of the entire scope of this file, everyone knows that there is a variable called car that has been defined, or at least initialized. When we first initialize this, car will have a value of undefined because we've not yet assigned any value to it. However, when our test suite runs, remember that first we will execute the before each before any it statement runs. So we run the before each, the car variable is assigned a value, and then when the it statement runs right here, the car variable will not only be initialized, but it will also be assigned a value of new car. We'll make some assertion around the car. The before each will run again. It will redefine car with a new car, and then the second it statement can then execute again. So the entire trick here is to just understand that we need to define our car variable ahead of time and specifically define it with a let keyword. We're using let here because we're going to change the value of car. If we had used const, remember const is short for constant. And in this case, car is not constant. As our code runs, we're going to reassign the value that car holds. So we definitely want to use let here. All right, let's now run our tests again and see how we're doing. So at the terminal, we'll execute npm run test. And then as you see, we still have 2 tests passing. Okay, now that's a very short, very little introduction to testing with Mocha. But of course, we had to do just a quick review or refresher ahead of time before we tried to dump both testing and Ethereum on you at the same time. So I think that at this point, we've got a slightly better idea of how testing with Mocha works. And we've most importantly have a better idea of how before each, describe, and it works. If you still feel really shaky on testing, and to be honest, I really would expect you to if you've never worked with Mocha before, don't sweat it. We're going to write a lot of tests throughout this course. And the tests that you and I write are really never going to be that much more complicated than the structure that you see right here. So I think that you'll definitely get used to this idea of testing very quickly. All right, before we move on, I do want to do a little bit of code cleanup here. So I'm not going to keep any of this testing code around. So inside of the inbox.test file, I'm going to highlight everything from class car all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to delete it. Now, if you want to save it, if you want to comment it out or copy it into another file, certainly feel free, but I'm going to empty out my file here. Do make sure that you at least comment your code out. Otherwise, you might end up seeing some error messages later on as we start writing some actual tests around our contract. Whew, I think that's it. Let's move on to the next video where we're going to start writing some tests around our actual contract. So I'll see you there.